I've been reading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and hands down, one of the best books I've ever read because the feeling that you get when you read the book is unlike any other. Have you read that book?
No, I was about to say I'm not familiar with the works of Marcus Aurelius. I've heard of him. I know of his escapades and everything, but I've never actually read his book.
Bro, you have to read this book. One of the things that interests me about this book is he speaks about God, right?
Oh
But
yeah.
it doesn't sound like how religious people would speak about God. It doesn't sound like how somebody who just believes in God or uses religion as a psychological crutch would talk about God. He speaks of
What's
it
that?
in a manner that I have not been presented with, which really interests me, and I'll tell you why. Because one of the main things about him that you can kind of smell off of his writing
Yeah.
is his love for nature and his pure understanding of how humans, animals, and everything in nature codepend on each other, and we're all built off the same elements.
Hmm.
And so I would think that, when somebody is so strongly aware of that situation, that a part of it comes with, you know, physics, a part of it comes with quantum physics, everything, science. You put all of them together, and then it makes you a very practical, realistic person.
Hmm.
And then you phase me by talking about God. It's very interesting.
So it kind of
It's
just throws it in the middle of what is it? Seems like a very comes off as a very logical person, and then suddenly, bam, throws
Yeah,
God in your face.
exactly. And it's it's interesting to me because I want to be someone who understands everything, and I have
Hmm.
this very curious desire to use whatever I can to my advantage, while at the same time realizing the true structure of what the world is moving on.
Hmm.
And one of those things that I've never been able to understand is God.
Right.
I've been able to understand what religion is, why religion matters, why the concept of believing in God and concept of devoting yourself to God can help manifest good things in your life.
Hmm.
But once you believe it, it's it's one of those, I mean, once you understand why people are doing it and you're able to read that psychology of why people use it, then you're not able to devote yourself as much into it because you have to truly believe in God if you want
Yeah.
God, if you want the concept of God to be available to you, you have to fully believe in it.
So, to me, we we both know my stance on these things, and it stems very much from that Abrahamic view of God, or that general omni view of God. And of course, I don't know what the context of this, how Marcus Aurelius talks about God is, but in general, at least the flavor of it that I'm understanding is how some people try to diverge or sort of disassociate themselves from this definition of an omnigod because they're agnostic theists, as we like to call them. They like to believe, but then they don't want to be associated with this oncoming sort of uprising of atheists who make binary decisions like myself. It's either yes or a no. So
Mm.
they're not ready to make that clear-cut decision. So they turn into agnostics who then present themselves in different manners, and then they try to justify their belief by saying that, oh, I don't necessarily believe in an omni god. Maybe you know the universe is God, or nature is God, or XYZ thing is God, or
Right.
believing in spirituality can be considered a form of divinity. So that's the kind of flavor that I'm getting from the way that he's describing God and his affinity to nature and everything. I don't know if that is the case, but to me, in general, people like that, um, sort of distasteful. Like I said, it's not a binary decision. Once again, you need to make up your mind. You can't just be sitting on the fence, especially for something that arguably has so much of an effect on people's lives, generational effects even. These religious teachings and everything, and these belief systems get passed on throughout generations. And if you're not even sure about it, and if you're still on two sides of the coin about it, how are you going to, you know, progress those teachings and build the minds of the people that come after you?
I agree with that. I think to some sense, like being sure of what you're doing, especially if you are a teacher and a leader, you have to be able to be You have to be able to provide confidence to the people that follow you.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it I stand at a fork in the road here because I want to be able to not always have a decisive answer on something, right? And
Mm.
there's two ways we could go about this. It's if you don't have enough proof for God, then
Yeah.
you can have a decisive answer just to say no. Or
Mm.
if you don't have enough proof for God, you don't have enough of a decisive answer to say no. So that's like where I'm in between, where I
Mm.
don't believe in the religious stories of God. I don't believe that that is what makes up God. However,
Yeah.
I believe that there is a force of the human animal that is capable of believing in something that exists like that and
Mm.
then reaping beneficial manifestations from it.
Yeah.
And so I've been in that position for a long time. However, when I read this book, it's like when you see someone being so neutral, so scientific, so spiritual about the reality of nature.
Mm.
A man who's faced with death, who's coming closer to death, faced with his old age, um, him being so serious about something like that and then saying obey God when he wasn't even
Mm.
Christian
Mm.
is so interesting because it's like I feel like there's some kind of untapped knowledge that we don't have because it's not being translated enough. And the people who follow God these days are following it off of posture.
Mm.
But it's almost as if he didn't need to express that posture to the people back then because they kind of already understood it because they were in tandem with God.
Right.
I mean, tandem in with nature.
Right. I mean, I understand the capacity with which, if there's any sort of positive effect or uh, any kind of sort of, general traits that you can pick up from this sort of belief, even if it be, well, in the typical case of people who are religious and spiritual, that it gives them sort of hope sometimes, and it gives
Mm,
them this sense of relief in trying times, and that's what we've been told at least, and that's the sort of bare bones version of looking at things. And when you mentioned that he's like Marcus Aurelius being like a at the time of writing all of this stuff, being a dying man, and the fear of death is it does weird things to people anyway. So again, not to make too many assumptions about it because we haven't even started talking about any of the contents of it.
right.
But in general, I feel like the most positivity you can get out of it is this idea of having someone looking down on you, the safety of being not being responsible for your own actions. And I think
Mm,
that's a double-edged sword. And that's my main problem with people who extract just that value from the concept of religious belief or any kind of belief system that they choose not to justify. And I need to underline the word choose not to, because the words rather, because it's usually the case that they don't care enough to be like, defended or anything. We've got a Christian apologists and we've got theologians and fucking people all around the world that defend their stance on why God exists, or the omni God exists, or the Abrahamic God exists, or where creationism is all right, or in other faiths as well. But what we see typically is the people that side with them, or like a vast majority of people, like you were saying, are postured to side with them because of this very specific thing, where they would rather feel safe in the hope and that someone is looking down. And again, it's to me, it's a way of like not taking responsibility for your own actions. As a person who doesn't take that stance, I feel more responsible for every action that I take. I feel more akin to make my decisions clearly, and I think twice before I do or say things. I'm not saying I don't make mistakes. I'm saying I recognize that all of my actions have consequences, and those consequences may not lead to a place where I like. And to me, that gives me a sense of responsibility. It makes me want to take up more responsibility. It teaches me to carry the burden and then increase it over time, and it provides me with that capacity to be dangerous. I feel like these are qualities that people lack, and to a large degree. And I can safely assume and say that because I've witnessed it, and it's very obvious as well. Age of the internet, you get to see people do stupid things. But yeah, I think my stance on people just believing for the sake of believing without actually justifying why they believe it is a problem in and of itself.
I question whether the way that religion works is you don't need to put responsibility on yourself in the way that we do it, but it's it's like they are taking responsibility without acknowledging that they are taking responsibility. Does that make sense?
It does, but how so?
So for example, there's a line that I was told a lot when I was a kid. The God helps the person who helps themselves. And so growing up I never really understood that line because it's like if I'm helping myself, why does God need to help me? Like I'm already doing all the work. What are you talking about? Like why would somebody else need to help me? And obviously later I realized that in reminding yourself that it's kind of like you are optimistically looking at the fact that the world will align itself to you if you make that action, but it's not like I failed and I have to make it better, which we both are in now, which I think like makes more sense to me as of in this point in my life to think like that
Yeah,
because everything I am responsible for.
yeah,
But isn't the action the same? That's kind of the thing that I'm questioning. Like, where if somebody believes that it's God will make their life better if they help themselves, they're still
mm,
being responsible because they started to help themselves. And now they're
mm,
also positive about the outcomes that may or may not occur. But both people are being responsible for themselves. One is believing that they are, and one is believing that if they do that, they will get something else. So there's like a form of hope.
yeah. But I feel like the ends don't justify the means is what the problem is with that sort of analogy, because in both cases, the fear of the consequence is there. But in the case of, let's take a very binary example. You've got a person who believes and the person who doesn't believe, right? Person who believes, and for the sake of simplicity, let's say this is a typical omni-god heaven-hell situation. So the fear of eternal damnation sort of far outweighs anything else in this believer's mind. And you've got the non-believer who doesn't sort of see anything of that sort. So that's lacking. And then on again on the spiritual side, you have the sort of joy and the euphoria of being cast into heaven. It's a motivator, it's a positive motivator. So you've got positive and negative reinforcement for the spiritual person. And then on the left side, obviously, you have once again nothing to look forward to. You have whatever he does is a consequence of his own actions. Now the problem here is, even though they reach the same end, and you're saying that the consequences of the actions that they take and the decisions that they make are both driven the same way and will provide the same sort of end results, you imagine the amount of responsibility that the person who doesn't believe takes upon himself is far greater, because the motivation isn't by some arbitrary means. The motivation in his head is simply, if I do it wrong, I will reap the consequences, and that is bad for me tomorrow.
Right.
And if I do something right, it's good for me, or it's good, is me doing something good for, XYZ reason. So
Mm-hmm.
there's no, it's not a I will reap the rewards or I will face a dire consequence sort of thing. It's sort of
Right.
equating, if I get into the situation of trying to help this woman with her stolen handbag, getting her handbag stolen, I'm going to get stabbed and I'm going to die. A person who's, you know what I mean? I'm trying to
Yep.
create this situation of there's that big end goal or the afterlife goal, um, even if that's not the case. But typically, when you have some form of un,
Expectance.
yeah, and we know how that goes. That fucking
Yeah.
same old story all the time. When you have
Yeah.
expectance, I can't speak today.
Yeah.
Expectance, and then you treat it a certain way. But when you don't have it and you still choose to make the same decisions, you see the amount of
Mm.
extra effort that goes into it, and that extra effort creates extra responsibility, and it creates obviously a much greater sense of purpose down the line.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, which is why it makes it so difficult for me to see that every great person on this who's achieved some of the greatest things, aside from scientific discoveries,
Mm,
uh, has been religious, has
mm,
believed in God, has,
mm,
and like, I have big aspirations in my life and I want to be able to make an impact from a
Yeah.
very from a like a an impactful way. And it I want to use everything to my advantage. I want to make the
Mm.
best out of everything. And one thing that I do realize from a neutralistic and scientific standpoint is that we have the ability to hope.
Yeah.
And the mistake can be made when you don't realize false hope from being able to use the facet of hope,
Yeah.
right?
Precisely. Yeah.
Right. And so I think I'm at a point, but I'm also cautious of claiming it, where I can realize what false hope is and what real hope is, and then be
Mm.
able to truly use that idea of belief as a facet to propel everything that I want to do in this life. However, it's a conundrum because you cannot use the facet of belief unless you truly believe,
Yeah.
right? The facet of manifestation until you truly manifest it. And to truly manifest something, you don't need God. I agree. I've done that in so many parts of my life where I truly manifest something and it happens without the use of God. But
Mm.
now what I question is the definition of of God might not have always been the omnipresent God that we speak of, and that's what we move into right now. So when he speaks of that, he speaks of it in a way of it already exists within us as a form that does not need to be named God, but he's choosing to use that word God because I believe it
Right.
might not have been as corrupted as it is now, 2,000 years later.
Mm.
And so
To
what
me,
I'm trying to understand is like his I'm trying to sit into his shoes and try to see what he's saying.
yeah, all I was going to say is that that's a fascinating way to take matters because the thing that I was saying earlier in the beginning, what I presumed that he was talking about is what regular people that are sort of, like I said, in the middle ground between a yes or a no, these fence sitters, as we like to call them, usually apply that logic into something that's very vague, like the
Mm,
universe, or
right.
this is God, or this action is God, or this inhibition is God, or this affection is God, or this feeling is God. But I don't think I've ever heard of anyone going inwards and saying that there might be a God within what we already understand as an individual. But do go on.
Yeah, like as a facet, I'm trying to contemplate whether there is a form of the human that is capable of not just belief. I think belief and hope might be like small, intricate parts of this whole system that we consider that we could be considered as God. But let's remove the aspect of God for now, and
Hmm.
let's talk about like the idea that I'm trying to get at or that I try to receive from what he's saying. It's
Mm.
almost as if there's an entity that is present within us, um, that holds the ability to recreate a future or to recreate the situations that lead up to what eventually becomes the future just by holding some kind of very strong belief, right?
Mm.
And that is the concept of manifestation essentially.
Yeah.
I've just put it in very complicated terms. But um when that happens, instead of thinking about it as just being able to manifest, what I'm trying to do is trying to observe what it is that is capable of actually creating the truth from manifestation, if that makes sense,
Mm. Yeah,
right?
it does.
We
Yeah.
all agree that manifestation exists. Everybody agrees.
Yeah.
Most people agree. But what is it? What is that strength? What is that energy that is capable of actually shifting the ways that we behave? And I'll give you. Okay, yeah, go ahead for it.
I was gonna say, that just to me sounds like the power of posture, if that makes sense.
Right.
But if we take manifestation and let's run with it, right? When you manifest something, and I am a firm believer in it, not the fucking you have, your birthstone is opal, or you have crystals, you rub it, you manifest this, listen to this, chant this 5 times, you manifest this shit in
Mm,
Instagram is blowing up my feed. Anyway,
mm,
moving swiftly along. Manifestation was when you sort of take an idea and you sit with it and you stew with it and you repeat it to a large enough degree that it becomes sort of second nature to you. And the key word, the operating word here being repetition, where manifestation essentially is a way of training yourself to in other words, posture yourself to
Yeah.
move in a certain direction that doesn't necessarily go against compulsions, but it usually does because
Yeah.
when you want to manifest something, it typically means that you're not naturally inclined to do that, which means you're compelled to do something else, which means
Right.
that yes, it does go against compulsions, but when you do manifest it, which means you repeat it again and again, you sort of posture yourself into doing that. But your
Yeah.
question is more of what causes, is it that, is your question what drives that posturing or what keeps it in place?
So I was going to like before I finish the thing, like that's what I was about to say. I think when you manifest something so strongly and you picture it and you believe it and you see it happening, you
Mm,
subtly, subliminally and consciously change the actions that you make, and obviously because the actions that you make change, you kind of lead towards that image of
hmm.
what you are manifesting.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what I'm thinking about is there's something that is capable of doing that even if you don't change your actions to some level.
Hmm.
Something just happens where you believe it happens so much that maybe
Hmm.
tomorrow you get offered a new job. Like within any possibility of changing any significant actions to create a butterfly effect,
Mm.
something has happened where you believe something is something so strongly, like things around you start to change, and that's what I'm curious about, because I
That's funny.
understand that pre-posture notion.
That's funny because the example that you used, to me, I just irks my inner skeptic, right? So to me, instantly, my brain just went to, well, yeah, it's just a coincidence, isn't it? You sit and because without action, and if you just you sit with something, like say the job thing or anything for that matter, you will something into existence is basically what that sounds like to me. And when you do that, or when things like that get fed into my brain, instantly I'm just like, no, that's just a coincidence. You were thinking
Yeah.
about getting a job tomorrow, you got a job, but you didn't act. There's no action in between. If
Right.
it's not actionable, it's not a posture
Right.
to me, right? And if you take the posture out of the equation, then it's like now we're reaching this fucking sticky gray area where what are we talking about exactly?
Yeah, that's the sticky area that I want to dive headfirst into.
Oh, so that's crazy. Let's do that.
So like, think about how many situations in life that we can call a coincidence. Even with that, I will say there is a pre-posture that already existed to create a coincidence, right? For example, you've like in my life, I have had episodes of being extremely postured towards the goal that I want to do, and then maybe a month of not manifesting it hard enough, and
Mm,
then by the end of the month you fit back into the what you're supposed to be doing, and then the next day something good happens, and then you realize that it's you're reaping the benefits of what you've already sown, right? And
mm,
so that's a big aspect of that. But however, like I don't think we can deny the countless stories that people have on purely just being a good energy, manifesting like this happy environment in their place and just good things happening to them.
mm,
And that's what like I want to dive into, but like it's such a undefined area that we don't know where to dive into.
mm. I mean,
Like,
I think of a place to start.
yeah.
Basically, just riding off of the last thing that you said, were people who sort of have this general aura of positivity around them. Good things tend to happen to them, or it's like that old saying where what is it? You attract who you are, or something like
Mm,
that. It's quite common, right? If you exuded like if you're very negative around, people just can smell it off you almost. And if you're
right.
very, bless you, actually, no, I don't know why I say that. Force of habit. It's a tangent, but I don't know why I keep saying that. Um,
An atheist saying
yeah, yeah,
that.
it's funny, isn't it? Jesus Christ, the fuck you. I think that's what I should say. Moving on. Um, well, you see, you hear about people who, generally positive, and then they keep attracting people that make others feel good, and people want to be around them and everything, so on and so forth. That to me is quite exciting, but on a very surface level. And by surface level, I mean in a very psychological scale, where um, not on just a very biochemical basis as well, but
Right.
it's generally what I understand, and my limited understanding of it is, or it used to be that people who are generally look or are positive on the inside, they have these small physical translations of that positivity in their actions and in their emotions and everything,
Right.
which people subliminally pick up on.
Yep.
And it's too hard for us to dive into exactly what it is and why that.
Right.
Are you making fun of my crab hands again? Oh
That's
my
such a
God.
Peterson thing, right? Like you love Peterson, so I see that you're learning from him.
I do. Jordan, if you're watching this podcast, you know what? Hit me up. We can work something out.
We're not there yet.
Anyway, crab hands aside, yeah. So there seems to be some sort of a reaction that generally translates into the physical, um, the way that people carry themselves physically in both positive and negative people, and that tends to sort of that message sort of gets delivered
Mm,
to the other people around, and that's where the butterfly effect starts, is what I'm trying to say. But however, that was the most basic way of understanding it. As we've grown together and as we've talked about these other things, I feel like I'm leaning more towards this thing that I was telling you quite a few conversations ago, with this people surround themselves with the type of energy, right? You have this ball of energy around you, and you carry that with you, and in that resides all these emotions that not emotions, feelings, anything you can imagine that's not tangible. You carry that within that bubble, and the things that are most unique to you and the things that are least unique to you all sit in the same bubble. But then other people have the same, similar bubble for themselves. And when two bubbles collide, as in two people meet each other and they engage in whatever conversation, or even before they do,
mm.
there's this sort of this
Recognition of
effect.
energy, right?
Yeah. So there's this. I was gonna say collision, but it's not that extreme. It usually
Right.
starts off with just the meeting, and there's an overlap, and there's either overlap or friction. I think that's the most binary way to define it. So that's why sometimes when you just like you meet someone, you want to punch them in the face, but then you meet other people, you're like, oh, they're nice people. At least
Right.
it is to me. I'm sorry, this is the way that I function.
No, no, I agree. I know some people like that.
Great, fantastic. So to the 70 people out there that I want to punch in the face, now you know why. But there's that feeling of either there's friction or overlap, and when there's overlap, I tend to. This is the area that I have. I want to think about, but I've never really thought about it to that extent. I don't know if the overlap is because the unique characteristics of one person and the not unique or the non-unique characteristics of another person are very different, and that's why there's an overlap, or is it the unique characteristics are too similar? Like are there more similarities that cause the overlap, or are there more differences that cause the overlap? I don't know.
That is an interesting question. That's like saying opposites attract, but opposites also repel to each other.
Yeah,
How
yeah,
much of it is what?
yeah. Because
I've
you can never.
always wondered that too.
So let's we could try to figure it out. For example, let's take you and me, right? When we met, uh, barring the circumstances, it took us a relatively very short amount of time compared to other people to get to a level where we're like, oh, we clicked and it was great.
Mm,
But was that because of the major amount of overlap that we do have, or the major amount of non-overlap that we also have? Because
right.
the friction is what keeps driving us to have these conversations in the first place. If we overlapped on everything, it would be a very weird dynamic. We
Right.
wouldn't be having this sort of dynamic. We would possibly not talk about a lot of things. It'd just be us fucking agreeing with whatever each other said and be
I
like,
think with us, what was one of the most important parts is the places that I needed you not to collide with, you didn't.
yeah,
And when we look at humans, we have some really strong characteristics and some not so strong characteristics.
yeah,
And I think if the really strong characteristics of two people collide, then
mm,
it doesn't work out, or they don't try enough to bond after that. I think the
mm,
really strong characteristics, if they are complementary to each other, then all the other sub characteristics kind of fit in place, and it doesn't matter if they overlap or not. In our situation, uh, I have a really strong characteristic that you have a really strong characteristic of, but it's a complementary characteristic. And
mm.
everything else we share things in common, and we also don't share things in common, but those just become interesting topics to progress on.
Okay, so you're creating an hierarchy of characteristics, which is interesting.
Mm.
So there, and not only is there an hierarchy of characteristics, there's a certain form in which these characteristics complement each other. So there's a association between these characteristics as well, which kind of brings to mind a lot of questions, but in a good way. But let's talk about that hierarchy of characteristics for a second. Let's take two very simple characteristics, right? Or I say simple, but let's say morals, or let's say I'm trying to think of something simpler to talk about. Things that people would generally not recognize in another person straight away, unless you openly spoke about it. You know, one of those things, like things that I wouldn't know about you unless I asked you. Things
Mm.
that you would be strongly, like the thing that we were talking about a little bit earlier, like belief systems and everything. Like, what are your strong beliefs and what are, not your strong beliefs or things like that. Even
Right.
though we have slightly differing stances on belief systems and everything,
Mm.
we're still talking about one of the, well, obviously on the same level of that hierarchy, because that spiritual belief would be kept in one level of that hierarchy,
Mm.
right? Now, if you were to say talk about something else like morals, we
Yeah.
would then be going to another level in that hierarchy, but we're still talking on that level. So
Mm.
you're saying that there's some form of association between the way that I think about each level of the hierarchy versus how you think about the same level of that hierarchy.
I'm establishing the hierarchy in terms of what defines your psychology the most. So there are some people whose psychology is defined the most by being disagreeable. And
Mm,
so for a person like that, if their strongest characteristic is to be disagreeable, whether that's a good or bad thing is a different thing,
yeah.
then the person that I think that they would get along best with is a person whose strongest characteristic is to be agreeable.
That is very interesting because when I met you, you were the most disagreeable person that were one of the most disagreeable people that I'd come across. But you weren't disagreeable in the, for the sake of being disagreeable, and which is what
Right.
drew me to it. You were assertive. You were disagreeable, you were assertive, and you were well leaning towards narcissistic. But on my end of things, no, wait, let me explain. These are all clinical
Yeah.
terms.
Right.
So just for you fuckers out there, they're questioning what I'm saying. Look it up.
Yeah.
I'm not lying about these traits.
Right.
So you were assertive, you're disagreeable, and you were also leaning towards narcissistic. On my end of things, I was agreeable for the most part, somehow also assertive, and somehow also narcissistic, leaning towards narcissistic. So the agreeableness, however, only reflected when we started talking
Mm.
because, but at the same time,
Mm.
I
Okay.
didn't know if that was a choice on my end or
Right.
if it was compelled because of the way that it felt when I was speaking with you. This is that subliminal part that I wanted to get
Right.
into. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't necessarily recognize it as being a choice because I didn't know that I was becoming agreeable suddenly
Right.
to like to respond to your disagreeableness.
Right. And that is very interesting because um when I am disagreeable, like I think we should define those clinical terms so that they understand a little bit better. But when we say disagreeable, it doesn't mean that everything you say he's less likely to accept just because he's less likely to accept. It's just that you have like your own opinions. You're staying true to your opinions. You're not just submissive about every single opinion. So
Yeah.
with that said, with us, what happened was I think we both established enough credibility with each other to
Yeah.
be agreeable and disagreeable at times. And in my situation, being disagreeable is not one of my strongest characteristics. However, it is my dad's. And so,
So, your
it's
father, tell me more.
Faja. So, it's one of those things that where it's obviously not an insult. It's just a characteristic, right? And
Yeah, yeah, of course.
why like my parents work so well with each other is because my mom is agreeable on those cases, and
Mm,
it definitely complements him. And so since we also met at a very young age and we established enough credibility to have enough respect for each other's words, we
hmm.
both kind of subsided our barely formed identities at 19.
Yeah.
And so, with our barely formed and freshly formed identities at 19, it's so much more malleable than it is later at life. So,
Mm,
I think what happened was when I established enough to you that I'm not disagreeing with you for no reason, I'm not
mm,
disagreeing you for no logical purpose, then you're like, okay, it makes sense to be agreeable. It doesn't hurt my identity. But it's
Yeah.
not also a part of your identity to be disagreeable. Maybe it is functioning at a point where that's your surface level, that's how you present yourself to first impression kind of way. And I think
Mm.
likewise for me also. But then once you start getting into the weeds of it and you start to realize who this person is, it obviously changes because each person has different brings out different characteristics in each person. We
Yeah.
we we all fit in different puzzles.
Yeah. I think that is very true. But just to kind of disassociate from this general notion that people can become different people around different social circumstances, because there's a word for that, and we stay very far away from that in general, and that is typically not a good idea to do. Anyway, the thing that we're talking about, just to clarify it for the people, is this nature of change that's brought about unintentionally, but
Right.
also through a conscious effort, but somehow that conscious effort isn't immediately recognizable. I think that's the key takeaway, and that's what I was talking about in the beginning, where we're just saying that I didn't consciously make the effort to become more agreeable, but it's just because the dynamic that we built and the way that you were saying the credibility, innately you gave me reasoning that I didn't seek, but it was established in
Mm,
subtext that it was enough for me
right.
to, and
Exactly.
because that agreeable or that disagreeableness wasn't one of my strongest character traits, and
Right.
it's definitely not part of my identity, because if it were, we wouldn't have seen a change. There would be
Right.
things that associated with the identity just tend to stick,
Right.
which, yeah, I think that's a very good way to put it. Now, if we take that and we sort of expand on it a little bit, is there a do you think there's a way to then, which the answer I know, but I want to see your take on it. Is there a way to manipulate this then to sort of progress the way that we deal with people and the way that we choose to deal with certain people?
And I think the greatest orators in the world have mastered this skill.
That answers the question, doesn't it?
You have to be malleable at some point, right? Like it's not even from a malicious standpoint. A lot of people can think manipulation is malicious, but I think it's such a great quality of a human to be strategic enough where he changes what he needs to say to get through to
Mm,
this person. It doesn't mean that you are trying to, be shady or anything, but that's
mm,
often the connotation of manipulation.
mm,
But what we're talking about is how to communicate to a person who has a fixed structure, and you
yeah,
recognize that just because you don't have the structure that's capable of fitting that fixed structure doesn't mean you are not compatible. As a good
yeah,
orator, what you have to understand is you have to be malleable in any structure to be able to fit that structure. And
yeah.
I want to work on this so much, man, because like I think that's the most one of the most uh let me see. Like one of the greatest qualities of a human being is to be able to free flow. And when you have a set identity, it doesn't allow that, which is why I'm so for losing your identity.
Yeah.
So
I
that malleableness requires what does it require?
I think there is great power in this idea of manipulation, especially when it comes to manipulating conversations, right? Because that's the context we're talking about it in.
Right.
Being a good orator, having people understand what you're saying on a large scale and a wide variety on a line of things, right? There's great power in this manipulation. Just by definition, sheer definition, manipulating something is changing it,
Right.
or changing it with a purpose in mind
Right.
to some ends, and that negative connotation that people associate with manipulation is because of the way that they commonly sort of toss that into very negative
Yeah, like
conversations.
gaslighting.
Yeah,
Right.
gaslighting, for example, and whatever else you might have, toxic and this and that, and all these fancy new words that people like to throw around. But the main, if you take words for what they mean and you apply them for the purposes that they were intended to be applied in, if you manipulate, say, I don't know, a chemical reaction, you tamper with it in some way, shape, or form to an ends, to comply with an objective, then you are still manipulating it. in the terms of a conversation, if you look at a conversation similar, like in a similar fashion, you look at it as a chemical reaction. You want the reaction to lead to a certain way. You want to induce a certain kind of response from the audience that you're referring
Mm.
to. Therefore, you will apply a manipulation strategy. You will
Right.
strategically manipulate that conversation to make the ends meet. And again, this is something that we've spoken about in many conversations ago, where we talked about the ultimate goal of having a conversation with somebody is so that both of you walk away with a little more than you already knew when you before you were coming into it. And the main purpose of communicating, or the main purpose of having a conversation, is to communicate information. And if that information isn't getting communicated correctly in under normal circumstances by just, if we suppose two people's natural standpoint is a net neutral zero, if the communication, or yeah, if the information isn't even getting communicated in that level, there needs to be something that's tweaked for the
Mm.
communication to get through. If the
Mm.
end goal and the purpose that I was saying, if the purpose is to provide information and to communicate information, so now
Right.
you've got an end goal, you need to devise a strategy. What do? You manipulate. And it's not the worst thing in the world when you put it into perspective, is it?
Exactly.
It and it not only is that the obvious purpose of manipulating a conversation, but it's a skill that not a lot of people can have. It's not sometimes you think of it as, some people are just prodigies in manipulation. They're just born knowing how to manipulate people. But, that is true and not. It doesn't go very far.
Yeah.
Early on in life, people are generally, you surround yourself with a society with people, or if you're, your community of people are easily sort of gullible people, you get that God complex within you. But to reach once you get to a level and you go beyond that point of your comfort zone, and you come
Mm.
across people who are smarter than what you're used to, that's when you need to devise a skill. And
Right.
to be able to talk to any form of person across a large variety of people, which they definitely do come in,
Mm.
that is a skill.
It's one of the greatest skills to have. And now there's two ways to look at this. I think the best way to look at it is when I think of what communication really is and the monster of communication, the monster of information that it holds to communicate something
Yeah.
truly. It's My lighting is getting pretty dark. Let me fix it a little.
Hold on, folks. We'll be right back after these messages. Communication is what we need to do. I can manipulate, and so can you. Put that on a t-shirt. He's got a big light. Mm-mm-mm. That's how you know he's a big man. Mm-mm. And if he had a big plan, mm, you know that he can do it too. Na, 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 na. I fucked it up for me and you. Story of my life. This is getting sad.
So, one way of looking at it when I think about it is I'm standing in front of a maze, and this maze
Mm,
is a person's identity. I am this
mm,
little small tiny being, and across this giant field there's a maze, and across that maze is another small tiny being. And these two tiny beings are trying to communicate to each other, but this
mm,
maze is characterized by each of our identities. And each thing that you truly want to communicate, instead of being able to send it right above the maze into the other person, you have to meander through all these different structures. And so, for us to efficiently communicate what we are thinking, you must be able to completely understand what the other person is thinking, and you have to be able to completely understand what the other person is not saying. And I
mm,
think
mm,
animals do this the best, because I think I've brought this example up before. When you go into the forest and the snake is around you, the only thing it's thinking about is how you smell, what your chemicals are. It's not thinking about what you are going to tell it. It's not going to think that if you are anxious and you say, I am not anxious, that it believes you. That's not how it works, right? It's efficient communication straight off the bat. For
yeah.
humans, it's so different because we have all these structures. And so when we have conversations with people, it tends to take so many different routes because of so many different misunderstandings. And if you get to the end, hopefully you've succeeded in that one topic. So
Mm.
that's the way that communicate. That's the way I look at communication. Now the other
I
way, yeah, go for it.
I was gonna throw my 2 cents into the matter by saying that the way that I look at it, which is I love the fact that you um talked about it in the sense of a like two mazes and you're trying to navigate, and the strategy that you're employing has to navigate through this maze to communicate that information, reach that tiny other person at the end of the other side of the maze, right? For me, I associate a separate character version of me that's involved in conversations in separate conversations, if that makes sense. So instead of a singular maze or putting myself out there all the time, I have a separate character that does the job for me. So my identity is safe and secure, very far away from the actual conversation. And I can get into
Right.
why that is.
But that's
But
essentially you taking your identity outside of the maze, making it less complicated.
so the maze, I'm trying to eliminate the maze altogether. So I'm not
Right.
circumnavigating anything
Right.
because when I'm talking to that person, I generally don't have, because the reason I want to eliminate the maze is because it requires you to understand that time it takes to strategize to navigate the maze involves you trying to figure out that person's identity and what makes them tick, so to speak, in the most
Exactly.
simple terms
Yeah.
first. That's the prerequisite to that. But
Right.
if you eliminate the maze altogether by putting your identity aside, you don't know this person. You don't know yourself at that point. So I treat a conversation with a stranger or a person that I don't know, or at least the first couple of times when we have a conversation, as a separate projection of myself, who's now attempting to have a conversation. So that projection sort of molds itself into
Mm.
a reflection of the other person, a very
Right.
weak reflection of the other person. So without having to actually understand what this person's identity is like, my character's already molded into it. So now my responses are already sort of shaped in the way that they will receive it, and they will definitely receive it. So it serves two things, right? It saves me a fuck ton of time trying to eliminate the idea of trying to figure them out because I'm already molded into the shape. And the second thing is I can be sure that whatever I say now is going to hit home, regardless of the way that I say it, because only going to say it in the way that this person now understands. So the efforts lost due to various forms of miscommunication are mitigated in that
Mm.
way. But yeah,
That
that's
is
my
very
stance on it.
efficient. But what happens when there's a point where this person's maze is so constricted and so complicated that when they pose their opinions that you clearly disagree with, this character that you have that's sort of kind of morphed into their character, how do you express that you disagree with that at the same time make them feel like, that they're comfortable talking to you and that you're getting their idea as well?
So for a person with a very complicated maze, to put it in general terms, it's people who are very closed off, right? People who've got like walls on walls on walls. For them, there's a separate sort of strategy involved. Well, it's not a separate strategy really. It's more of this is where my general nature gives me the upper hand sometimes, where I generally don't care about the end goal of the conversation. As in, I don't care about if a conversation needs to go a certain way or another way or another way, right? There's no propaganda on my side. Most of my manipulation is limited, actually, all of it is limited to the actual conversation itself, not the end goal of the conversation. I'm not manipulating the conversation to reach a certain end goal because that
Right.
would be, the wrong way to think about it. So because of that, because I have no intention of reaching a certain end goal, if a person who shows up like this with a very complicated maze or has a lot of walls or whichever way you want to look at it, that translation of information is not going to happen in the first conversation. And because I don't care enough for it to, I'm not putting everything I have into the first interaction that we have. So I'm happy to let them go and come back later. But because of this character projection and then having molded that character into their shape, they will now feel much safer coming back a second time. So essentially, the only thing that's happened in the first couple of interactions, sometimes couple of interactions, or sometimes at the very first interaction, is that they now feel comfortable because, like I said, it's sort of like a reflection. So it's almost like they're talking to themselves at a point.
Mm.
They will feel much more at ease coming back a second time around to have a conversation. Maybe then
Right.
we can have a means to an end. Or if not the second time, maybe the third time, maybe the fourth time. And like I said, each time I'm still in a position of I don't care where the end goal of the conversation is, as long as there's a communication of info or there's some form of information that's being communicated. It doesn't matter what that information is. It doesn't have to be a very large amount or a very significant amount of information transfer. As long as the information is transferred, I'm satisfied. They're satisfied. No one's looking for a means to an end. And most, like all of the cases that I've faced with people who are very closed off, 100% of the time, no matter how many trials it takes, they've always come back and they've eventually reached a point where what I like to call the sweet spot, where everyone reaches a point where they're just happy to talk and they're like, you're very easy to talk to because you're essentially talking to yourself at that point.
Yeah. I feel like I'm trying to think about in what kind of situation I would be where there is no end goal to discuss. I often am so busy with the amount of work that I'm doing or the goals that I'm pursuing that the
Mm,
people that happen to come into my life are either, it happens at random,
hmm
and at those points, like those conversations wouldn't last for more than a long time unless I see like some true value in it. And then when I see some true value in it, like there's ideas that they pose to me where I feel like if I just told them this much, they would get what I'm trying to say. And so for me, I'm I choose less to have more open-ended discussions
hmm
in the way that I don't have any information to say beforehand. Obviously, I don't know what I can say. Like imagine I just met a guy and I already have a
hmm
propaganda to talk to him. I'm not
hmm
saying it like that. I'm saying it in the way as the conversation starts to shape itself.
hmm
I realize how I can add value and how I can take value.
hmm
Apart from that, I'm not just sitting to have a fun conversation. I think that's where it differs
hmm
for me, is where I've changed the type of life where I have like I haven't found myself in a situation where I just sit down and have a purely just fun discussion with somebody because it's not
hmm
fun for me anymore.
Yeah.
For me, a fun discussion is when we're talking about something that like has no answer and we
Yeah.
fucking find the answer later, where we
Yeah.
use the most uncomfortable forms of communication, the most uncomfortable disagreements, and then we really take something out of the conversation and we go back, like you
Yeah.
said. Those for me are really fun, and I know that like you're that guy too because
Yeah.
we have a podcast together. But you're also in a position to be able to have that open-ended conversation,
Yeah.
which I
Well,
would like to say I'm open-ended as well. It's just a different definition of it.
yeah.
It's not that I really care if I am or not, but it's one of those situations where I'm in my life where I'll have a conversation with someone that I see value in, and if it's no value, I'll pull out and I'll leave. And
Yeah.
the ones that I have conversations with value in, I want to be better at throwing the value above the maze.
Mm. I think the main sort of takeaway that I'm understanding from what you described is the point of you having conversations with people is to always the objective is to extract value in some way, shape, or form because of the limited time and the effort that it takes. Weighing the efforts with the actual time you could be utilizing with someone else. You would rather come out of a conversation with having some sort of valuable information extracted or delivered, one or the other. And particularly with people that you care about, you would be very akin to pursuing that with more tenacity. With me, it's less so about being open ended, but more so about the belief that people will come back. And that conversation, it's like I'm playing the marathon, you're playing the sprint. That makes sense. I the part of that equation that I don't care about is, like I said, when that valuable conversation happens. I'm always open to, like I said, both of our end goals on the very basic level is the same, is to extract or to have a valuable information at the end of the conversation, come off of it with some sort of value transferred. Either you gain value, you deliver value, or in an ideal situation, both of you gain something valuable and separate yourselves, right? For me, I when you say open-ended, it reminds me of small talk, which I'm not a fan of. I don't really care to chat about the weather. I don't really care if it's pissing it down. Not my problem. But in any sense of the conversation, I can also manipulate those conversations to make them go in a general track of where um, actually, this is a good time to talk about this other facet of conversational skill that sometimes people have, which is planting the seed. Sort of, I like to call it inception. Because if you're familiar, if people out there are familiar with the movie Inception, you know what I'm talking about, where you put the seed of an idea into a person's mind, and then you let it fester and let it grow, and eventually you reap the rewards later on. The way that you do that is by guiding the conversation or taking it in a certain way. So if there is a particular objective in mind where you want to reach, let's say, for example, in the case where, the example that you posed where you think somewhere along the conversation that the other person has something of value to provide to you, but you just don't know how to extract that value from them at that point. In your situation, you would brute force it. You would try to get it out as
I'm not
quickly as
saying that.
possible.
I'm not saying that. But I'll let you make the point. That's not what I'm saying at all, though. So since I interrupted you anyway, I might as well just finish that thought instead of just leaving it there. You said for me to sprint and for you to marathon. For me, it's not a sprint. For me, it's I'm gonna hold your hand and say that we can walk faster in this marathon. Why are we so slow? That's what it is for me. And I don't really have like a selfish objective to extract value before it comes out. It's just what I wanted to interject with. That's because that's what it started to sound like. I don't have an objective before I speak to this person, but as I speak to this person, if I see that there's an objective starting to build, then to get to the point of that discussion is what I want. It's not that I would have any value from that anyway. Most oftentimes I don't get any value from it because those are things that I already know. I
Okay.
just I just want to take their hand and run a little faster. That's what it
Yeah.
is.
So having said that, I think to put it in that way, the point to take it from there, the point still stands, which is in you taking their hand and trying to compel them or to actually ask them, or whichever way, to move a little bit faster and get to the point a little bit sooner than it would normally take. That's the part that I don't care about, is what I'm saying. That's where the difference lies. So
Right.
instead of guiding people down a conversation where you want to guide them to get to a point, I found that the easier way to do that and the more efficient way to do that is to plant the seed. And it works. For me, it's worked all of the time. Because what I figured is when people feel like they're being pushed or driven in any way, shape, or form, no matter how light it might sound, when they're being pushed in a certain direction, they feel kind of repelled to not go in that direction. So there is
Mm-hmm.
that form of like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to get to that. I want to chat about something else, or I want to
Mm-hmm.
talk about something else. I want to reach a certain point. I want to distract myself from that perspective. So it makes matters much worse.
Right.
And then you have to try twice as hard to bring them back on the actual course and then start guiding them again, which is that friction that builds in conversation. But if you plant a seed instead, right, you put that idea into their head, they feel like they came up with it and they feel like they want to talk about it now.
And so I think this is where the difference lies is like the people that I try to attract and the people that I do eventually successfully attract are people who don't have that need for waiting for a while. There are people who want to get to the point as well. There are people who already understand that what I'm about to say is not going to be small talk, like both of us. We're
Yeah,
not going to start and talk about the clouds for a half hour and then ease
yeah,
into a conversation and then drop the seed and everything. Although that is
yeah,
a very valuable trait for people that you speak to who are not like that, I often don't find myself in situations like that. But
right,
when we speak about the skill in itself, I'm sure that's a very valuable tool to use
yeah,
where you are consciously doing that. But at the same time, like I allow the conversation to run in a natural manner where if I plant the seed, it's like instead of planting the seed, I will show you the flower. Do you understand the flower? No. Okay, look at the flower like this. No. Okay, look at the flower like this. And that's
mm,
what I try to do most times. And I'm successful most of the times. But where I stand now is since I already know that those are the people I attract and I'm successful with those people, how do
mm,
I talk to a person who is so dense in his head where he cannot listen to anything that he's saying, right?
yeah,
And now another question arises is that how much time do I have to really waste on that?
yeah,
Do I even want to talk about that?
yeah,
If I do, okay, maybe then I'll use that tool to do it. Of course, like I've been forced in situations where there are people who I love who are exactly what you said, who need the seed to be planted and stuff like that. I've not been
mm,
good at it previously, but I've been great at it
yeah,
afterwards. It's just how much are you willing to do it and for what reason? and then it starts to come to a point where, like, okay, but you're not already thinking about these things. So if you're not already thinking about these things, there's no reason for me to plant a seed in your head. I would argue
Yeah.
that that itself is the expectation that you are receiving, because what you're saying is you plant the seed and you say that. So doesn't that come with expectation? Because
Okay.
you're planting
So
a seed when there is no fruit for it.
yeah. So I'll try to answer that one at a time. First, I think with the nature in and of itself of you attracting a certain kind of people and you being more comfortable or your experience having met only a certain kind of people who behave in a certain way for you to make it so that when you guide them, it's convenient to for both parties involved to reach that conversation. I feel
No,
like
that's not what I said. I said the people that I choose to have conversations with are like that. I've met all types of people, obviously, and I still have conversations with them. You just made it
okay,
sound different.
okay. So if you're choosing to have conversations with certain kind of people, I don't do that. I can have conversations with anybody and reach the same end goal with the generalizability factor, which is common to all of it, which makes it so that I don't have to choose who I have a conversation with. Is this planting the seed thing, which is what I was talking about. So it doesn't matter who is involved in the conversation, you still reach the same end goal, right?
Yeah. Okay. Go on.
I feel like there's someone that you want to interject with if
Yeah,
I've gotten wrong.
because I yeah. Okay, fine. So I will interject. I what is the concept of you not being able to talk to everybody with no expectation? As in, you're saying you don't
I didn't
choose
bring
who
up
you talk.
expectation just yet.
Okay,
That
so
I'm just
you're
saying that the
saying you don't choose
generalizability.
who you talk to. You just talk to
No, yeah,
everybody.
yeah. Because whoever wants to have a conversation can have a conversation.
Yeah, I'm not saying I will shy away the conversation, but a person who doesn't want to have the conversation that you want to
Mm,
have that moment, right? Like, say
yeah.
for example, you on your mind you're thinking about bagels, and this person wants to talk about sharks.
Mm.
Obviously, you won't talk about bagels, is what you're saying. Like, you'll still talk about sharks. That I get,
No, yeah, yeah. To some degree, yes.
right? And then you'll
But
plant the seed of a bagel, and then you'll get the.
well, yeah, because if they wanted to if they wanted to talk about sharks and I continue talking about sharks, that would be the equivalent of small talk, which is what I don't want to do. What I'm saying is, instead of telling them straight away or making it very obvious or less obvious or whatever way, instead of insinuating at all that I don't want to talk about sharks, make it so that they also don't want to talk about sharks. Which is, again, that's what I'm trying to lean into. That's the generalizability factor of it. If you get them to think that they don't want to talk about the thing that they really want to talk about, they now think that they
So
want to
isn't
talk about
that
something else.
doesn't that come with expectation then?
It's not an expectation really. It's more of I don't want to do it. So it's more of like a because I don't want to do it, I would rather have it. It's selfish if anything, but that's par for the course when it comes to manipulating a conversation in it. So again, the end goal is not that I want to talk about something. It's more that I don't want to talk about this particular thing. That makes sense.
So if you don't want to talk about that particular thing, what seed are you sowing? Because when you plant a seed, you know what seed it is.
It's a seed of not talking about sharks. And if they come up with something else that I don't want to talk about, you plant a seed of I don't want to talk about that either. Usually, I should introduce another thing here. Usually, people when they refrain from talking about one thing or the other, if they feel very, let's say the concept of sharks, right? If people want to talk about something, it usually implies that they feel very strongly about that particular thing at that moment. When you establish or you put a seed of or you distract them away from something that they really want to talk about, the general thing that happens is they jump to the next most significant thing that they want to talk about. And typically, people only have a handful of things that they're very interested in talking about. So well, it does two things, right? First, it lets me go through each of those very valuable things that they want to talk about like straight away, so I can recognize whether any of those things are things that I want to have a valuable conversation about. And secondly, because I've distracted them away from things that I don't want to talk about, eventually we'll get to a point, if at all there is one, of a conversation where we're only talking about something that's both valuable to the two of us. So instead of taking 100 different things and picking them out one after another, or instead of picking one thing and brute forcing my way through it, what I'm essentially doing is using their the way that they've been postured against themselves.
So what you're saying is you, instead of talking to the people that you want to talk to, you will talk to everybody, but you will still talk about what you want to talk about.
I will talk about what is most interesting that they have to talk about. And the way that I weed through what is most interesting that they want to talk about is by doing this. Eventually, sometimes I'll come across people that have nothing to, like, nothing that interests me to talk about. But that's a very crude way of saying it. I'm sure everyone has something of value because if you're passionate about something, eventually we'll come out of it with some different perspective or something of value. But until we reach that point where I'm like, okay, this is something that I really would like to get into, I will keep planting the seed of distracting them from something that they think is valuable, but it's not valuable to me.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense.
Yeah,
I don't function like that. It's interesting how we both take different routes.
yeah,
I like to function in the way that if the conversation becomes what it is, then like if it's interesting me, it interests me. And then what for me is most interesting, which is why it seems like I have um an objective before the conversation, is because I want to study the person. And so because I
mm,
want to study the person, I'll ask them questions that intrigue me. And most of the people that I happen to meet just by, I guess, energetic attraction is are the people who feel the same way about me. And so
yeah,
we get into this extended conversation of trying to study each other as opposed to speaking about the topics. And then that's when I realized that at certain points when I'm trying to study the person too much, they get uncomfortable.
mm,
And and they kind of like shy back because a lot of people have these shields that we talk about, right?
mm,
And so here what I notice is that it's very valuable for me to, if I want to study that person, not to obtrusively enter that field of that force field that they've created for themselves. And so
mm,
there I would use the tool of planting the seed, if so I care enough to
mm,
obtrude that wall. And in another situation where the person's wall is like just weak enough for you to smash through it, I've been in very many situations where that it creates much more of an impact as opposed to the seed tool. So like it's interesting how both of these things work, and it all ties back to the idea of how communication is so large and
yeah,
that they're all different tools to use for different
yeah,
times, different places. And I guess some of us are strong in some things and so we rely on that. Some of us are strong on the other things and so
yeah,
we rely on that.
yeah. I
The
was,
other thing I wanted to bring up was what happens when a person is extremely strong at orating, where they're able to now convince ideas. And the first thing that I think of when I say very strong orator is Hitler. Hitler, I think, is one of the greatest examples of being an amazing orator. And I say this with no, uh, I'm not looking up to him for the person that he is, but the way of influence that he had is something that I could definitely look at and be like, that is a admirable trait.
yeah, of
I
course.
think all of us should be able to put down this crazy idea that everybody is just evil. Like just take what you need to take and bounce, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so with that said, like looking at what he is able to do, he is not getting through to people. He is making people. And it's like a
Yeah,
very fine line that you have to be careful about, because I've had conversations with people where I'll be able to strongly convince them, but then I feel like I'm not talking to anybody right now.
mm,
Like, if are you just believing what I'm saying, or are you really thinking? So I'll take a step back and I'll contradict myself on purpose so that
mm,
I plant that seed. And so now that I
mm,
think about it, I'm planting seeds as well, but
mm.
not like how I would like to. These are things where like I want to step back and actually make them think about the point so they argue the point with me instead
Yep.
of just understanding it. And then in those situations, I end up doing that because I can't leave a conversation knowing that they just agreed with everything I said. That's one of the worst things for me. Even
Yeah.
though that's what I'm working towards, that we both come to an agreement. If you just
Mm,
agree with everything I say, I'm like, I don't know.
yeah. Well, as a just if you take the conversational toolkit, which we sort of have reached being the premise of this conversation, obviously these are things that are very powerful tools in both regards, right? And the way that we've learned to use these different tools in a certain fashion because it works the best way. is just a matter of consequence and experience and how things have worked out and shaped. Um, but the thing about people agreeing to everything you say, which I understand that you want them to agree because what you say, because firstly you want them to understand what you're talking about and then agree with you on the sense that you are you've made a good argument, you've posited a good
Right,
reason,
we could both
a
agree
line
on
of reasoning.
facts.
Yeah. So then when you've worked for it and there's effort values put into it and then they agree with it and you understand that someone that is capable of understanding everything you've said has now agreed to it, like the conversation we had yesterday off camera, which is, well, a fascinating fucking conversation where we both came in with very strong stances and then eventually we reached a consensus and we agreed with you. So that's sort of things that need effort to go into it. One idea that gets which regularly gets people, and I felt that yesterday as well. It's called the yes train. So if you get someone
Mm.
to
Yeah,
you, this is a very another very important conversation skill. If you ever want to get someone to agree to a final end goal, right? You lay out a set of premises. It doesn't matter what how many premises there are, but obviously the more premises you have leading into the final objective or the final point that you're going to make, the better it is, the longer the
right.
train of thought.
Mm. Yep.
So in each section of that train of thought, you get that person to say yes, and it always starts with the first train of thought. And typically that's the most agreeable part of the whole conversation. So let's say you want to get from point A to point B, where
Yep.
point A is very agreeable, point B is least agreeable, but point B is where you want the person to get to. And although this sounds very underhanded, it is typically what people do subliminally most of the time, and they don't recognize it and they feel the sense of victory. But what they're actually doing is they take a set of premises from A to B, and they get the other person to start agreeing on every premise starting from A. Obviously, A being the easiest premise to agree with, B being slightly kind of irking. I was like, I don't know if I completely agree with that, but sure. You know those personality tests where they're like strongly agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. Think about that, right? So once they get to the neutral point, which is like the third premise or something like that, people are just like they're talking about a certain conflicting point, but because they've said yes the previous two premises, it'll be easier for them to like be like, yeah, yeah,
More
sure.
likely
What
to.
you say,
Yep.
yeah, yeah. So you're like,
Yep.
yeah, sure. And it's very hard for people to catch themselves doing it. So the likely scenario is that
Yep.
people will not disagree with it, which is, like I said, the underhanded part of it is because you think that you're now manipulating the
I
actual
think
person
it
of the
it
conversation.
sounds it sounds underhanded the way you're putting it, but I'll clarify to the people who are watching. Like what you are saying is eventually when you get to a yes train of thought, they are more likely to agree with you. And for you to consciously even create a yes train is just a strategy that you're taking. But that doesn't mean that they won't eventually have their own thought and be able to disagree to you like after
Yeah,
four yeses, right? It's a
yeah,
it can be used as a strategy, but it's less often even achievable because you
yeah.
can't even talk about the certain things that you can't just say yes to everything if you come in with a disagreement, right?
Oh
You
yeah,
have to
that's
be
true.
able to make points on points on points.
Yeah.
And so now if one of the tools is to make four open points
Mm.
and one point that you don't disagree with, and then you close all those 3 points at once, that makes a
Yeah.
larger impact. And so it
Yeah.
depends on how people try to approach the making the point situation. And I think at the end of the day, if it makes sense, then the other
Mm.
person agrees.
Yeah.
Even if they say yes for like 3 times, and in the last sentence you said, I'm a piece of bread," they'll still disagree with you. So it's
Yeah.
not. It's like you can only get this is like this idea of being underhanded with conversation. The idea of trying to manipulate people comes from this victim mindset
Yeah.
of not being able to see that you're just stupid enough, you're not smart enough to see what the other person's doing,
Yeah.
right? And that's
Yeah.
not like you should be able to conjure your own thoughts. You should be able to
Yeah.
understand what is happening. And with a person, with two people who are able to do something like that, when we have conversations like you brought up
Yeah.
yesterday's, we both knew what idea we had.
Yeah.
And I guess, yeah, we had a yes train now that I think about it towards the end, but that's only because we set up all those points in
Yeah.
between
Yeah. Yeah.
and we disagreed on all
So
of them.
yeah. So because it sucks that I have to clarify it
Yeah.
regardless, but since you did, it saves me the trouble. The yes train that was yesterday, I wanted to then contrast between a regular yes train and the train we had yesterday, but even though the actual tool that was used is still the yes train, it was with a better purpose in mind, and like you said, and rightfully so, that the points were already laid out. It was more of a sense of tying them up together in a ball finally, because we talked about various tangents of on each of those premises. We spoke about different tangents, and there was different agreements and disagreements throughout those individual tangents. But the
Mm.
final point was each of those tangents tied onto the same objective, which was the question being spoken about was, are morals, are they instinctive? Are they innate in humans? So that in itself, if I put it out there, it's like, whoa, right? There's a lot of stuff to break down and come across it so you can understand where those tangents are coming from. But towards the end of it, what had happened was, okay, we've spoken about all of these things, all of these premises independently. Do you agree with premise one? Yes or no? Yes. Because
Mm.
yes, there was enough evidence to believe in premise one. Do you agree with premise two? Yes, because there's independent. So whatever, that's yes train got to the point where,
Right.
finally we agreed. But um, again, since we spoke about the S train being so easy to get caught into, there's also an easy out to it. Just give yourself 2 seconds to think about a question before you answer them. Just
Right.
take the fucking time to sit on it and stew on it for a bit before you answer the question. Don't just spit it out, you know. Do you actually agree with what the question is? If
Yeah.
yes, then yes. If no, then no. You're
Yeah.
open to disagreeing with any point, which is why it's not a surefire way, but it is to a degree where, like you said, people that don't recognize, or they're not capable of recognizing these small nuances in
Mm.
conversations, where they're just like, you know what. But also, interestingly enough, the dynamic of two people plays a very important role in this yes train as well. If the dynamic is such that the person making, or the person putting you on the yes train, assumes a more dominant role compared to your relatively submissive role in the conversation, more like the likely scenario is that the yes train is going to fall through, and the more likely scenario is that the more submissive person between the two of you is not going to refute or not going to think about any of those points, because there's that internal feeling of, there's this credibility from fear is how I like to think about it.
Mm.
Because of that dominant submissive dynamic, you're like, part of you is fearful of the conversation,
Mm.
it's subliminally so, and so you just choose to agree with it. Is that they have the position of authority, and you respond to authority in kind. But again, for both of us in particular, I don't know about other people, because we don't take lightly to authority just because, or just like that, which also speaks towards why we're disagreeable in certain aspects, sometimes prematurely disagreeable, especially in situations of authority. At least I am prematurely disagreeable, even though if I have to then forcibly switch my perspective and put myself in neutral ground when talking to people like that, or people that want to automatically assume a dominant position in the conversation when they haven't earned it. So that credibility of fear never plays a part. Always disregard that in the beginning. Anyway, I'm going off on another tangent, but the point is that you could just stew on each of those premises, and you can choose to disagree with each one of them when you choose to. But the dynamic is also a major influence in this that yes train.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting how some people try to subconsciously create this yes train, and in order to do that, they're going to oversimplify the point to such an aspect that you cannot disagree with it, and they will say it in
Mm.
such a weird context, in such a plain context
Mm.
where you kind of forced to say yeah to it, and then they will
Yeah.
use that affirmation that you just gave yourself,
Yeah.
and then they will bring
Yeah.
up an
Yeah.
actual point that has nothing to do with it, and
Yeah.
then they will kind of
Yeah.
manipulate you to say yes. But what
Yeah.
happens is, when you leave that conversation, if you feel like you have understood, that means you have not been manipulated. If you leave
Mm.
that conversation and you have not understood anything, but you're saying yes to this is like an innate quality that everybody has. I think
Mm.
um, sometimes a lot of people underestimate how smart humans are, right? Like we think there's all these vulnerable, naive people around us. Like, no. Once you cross a
Yeah.
certain age, everybody is smart enough to know how much they understand. It becomes a very gut feeling thing. You walk away
Yeah.
from a conversation and you feel it, and you are humble enough to accept it, then you walk away knowing that you've understood something. Sometimes you walk away from a conversation having understood everything, feeling like you understood everything, but not humble enough to
Mm.
accept it.
Yeah.
And that doesn't allow you to accept it. You come back again. And then the other type of people are like who just don't understand it at all, but then just say yes
Yeah.
because, like you said, they're responding in
Exactly.
kind.
Yeah.
And that's one situation that I don't like being in, because like it doesn't even give me a feeling of closure. It's like, what did we just speak
Mm,
about? That's what I'm saying.
yeah.
Like, these things I can pick up on very quickly in the conversation, even before the yes train even starts. If there's a agreement, when I clearly see that you haven't understood anything,
Yeah.
I either take a step back to make them argue again and again, or I just, like, like, I just
Yeah.
recognize that they're too naive to be talking to me right now, and
Yeah.
I don't want to like influence their young, soft, supple minds.
There was a clear example of this previously in this same conversation where I was trying to make respond to a couple of questions and make a certain point, but after the first point, took a step back because you could see that there was something that you had to say, which is not in the same context of matters that you were talking about, obviously. This is just an example of when two people who are probably I cannot speak today, who properly understand the way that the conversation is going, how conversations work, how to use conversational toolkits. When two people are having a conversation, and it's not this time the matter of the objective wasn't to just make a point or put the point across.
Right.
The clear objective at that moment was, because I knew you had something that you wanted to interject with but chose not to, I would much rather you interject with it right now so that we can go off on that and talk
Right.
about that and expand on that, instead of me just making a point for the sake of fucking making a point.
Yeah.
There's no ego attached to any of this. I mean,
Yeah.
there is, but that's a different conversation.
Yeah. I mean, there's always ego attached to it, but there's a conscious subsiding, is what we're doing,
Yeah,
like, in both
but
sides of the conversation.
yeah, but the S train and the concept of the S train that you were talking about, obviously the soft, supple-minded people, is quite interesting. Uh, but to me, in my head, it just translates the neoliberal fucking people, and I
Oh,
specifically
they're not
mean
soft at all, bro. What are you talking about?
no, no, that's the that's the well, what I meant to say was neoliberals, right? If you identify as a leftist or a liberal or a conservative, whatever, but whatever your political inclinations are, neoliberals in specific, and both of those terms are relevant to what I'm the point that I'm making. Um, the whole making starting the yes train with premises that are not even related to the final objective, instead of doing the logical way of breaking down a complex premise, which is the final objective you want to reach, into multiple smaller premises, and then realizing or recognizing if the other person agrees with each of those premises. What they'll do, neoliberals, is start off with a completely unrelated premise, make these absurd associations, and then somehow equate it to the like audacious statement that they're about to make towards the end of it. You know, the
Mm,
matter might be, I'm trying to think of a good example, and I did have a good example in mind, but I can't think of it. But it's like, oh, so you believe in X thing, so you must also
right.
believe that Hitler was right or the Holocaust was
Right.
a good thing.
Right.
Like, what are you fucking talking? And then they again, this fear credibility. This is like a different version of the fear credibility, the fear of credibility, or whatever I was talking about in before this.
Mm,
Um, it's more of like a fear of being associated with a an extremely negative perspective, or
mm,
being perceived in a very extremely negative connotation because of the that social anxiety starts irking people. They're like,
right.
oh no, I don't want to be associated with Hitler. So then they change their stance, which is fucking that is one of the most crippling things I've ever seen in people having conversation. I've only seen this recently, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
But I've personally, again, once again, if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, you're completely capable of saying no, that's not the fucking thing that I'm making. Uh, a good example of this is fucking jokes, right? Ricky Gervais, one of my favorite all-time favorite people in general. He is under this strict sort of idea that you can joke about anything
Yep.
because a joke doesn't have to punch up or down or fucking sideways or in circles.
Great guy.
Joke doesn't have to punch it. Yeah,
Great
it
guy.
the joke does not condone the actual activity, right? You can joke about rape. It's not the same as you being like you're being into rape or that you don't care about people who've been raped or that's
Right.
an extreme way to put it, but that's just I'm saying sometimes that's the lengths that people will go to carve the conversation into something that they want to. It's like, oh,
Right.
so you joke about rape, that means you must
Yeah.
support rape.
Condone it. Yeah.
No, two completely fucking different things,
Yeah.
right? or the way that he jokes about when the Caitlyn Jenner thing was still a big deal and the media was talking about it. All he said was, whatever he said in the joke, and it's like people called him a transphobe and this and that. So,
So I like the more I think about it now, uh, I feel like that stems from the idea of how they learnt it, right? And all,
mm,
this I'm seeing this happen with this whole new Andrew Tate fan base also, which the whole neoliberal and neo right wing red pill whatever thing, it's happening because I think that's the
oh
way they
yeah,
learn it, right? Like, so for example, let's take what we just spoke about before this, the yes train that you create. There
yeah,
are people when like for example when Andrew Tate is talking to people on a podcast, he is
hmm,
tailoring his conversation to speak to that person, and he
yeah,
is accurately targeted what they need to hear and what they have argued with him, and then he will
hmm,
make them understand it. But the people who are watching it, even though he might be saying the right things, the people who are watching it will not absorb the information properly. What they absorb is
hmm,
bits and pieces of the information that create the yes train. And likewise
mm,
on the other side as well, bits and pieces of information that create the yes train to think that you're a racist or a Nazi or a
yeah, yeah,
sexist. And so the only way to be able to explain that to someone else is to recreate that train, and you have no conception of it truly. And I've
yeah,
noticed this in a lot of school kids when they come back from learning something like this from somebody who actually meant it from some other way. They have a yes train that's created and they need to propagate this information to everybody else. I remember this was a big thing when the whole environmentalist um, propaganda became like a thing, like where everybody
mm,
has to give a fuck about the environment and stuff. When it became a propaganda, not the fact that it's not a real thing.
yeah,
When that started happening and they started teaching it in schools to force us to do certain things,
yeah,
I went back, and I know this like intimately because I went back to my parents, being wanting to spread the word, wanting to
mm,
say that hey, we're wrong. Look, we are genuinely wrong.
mm,
Let's make a difference here. But the only way I know how to explain it to you is the points that just stuck out to me.
yeah, yeah,
And now what's happening on the on this neoliberal side is that they have those points, they have good intentions, they truly want, like some of them who truly want
mm,
to
yes,
believe who that they they are on the right side and they want you to understand it, and so they will use these trains of yeses to make you
mm,
understand it. And it's so far beyond um emotionally depressing to be that racist or to be that bigot that you will do
mm,
anything to fight that point because somewhere down the line you don't want to be a racist. So what they're really protecting is the idea of not being racist. But the way
mm,
that they have been taught to be a racist is in these yes trains that they're not
yeah,
really thinking about. And on the same
yeah,
way in this side, when they are not really thinking about what it means to be masculine, these random fucking Andrew Tate fanboys are going around like fucking talking shit to girls, talking down to uh general human beings. Like, that's not the way he means it. He is actually a
mm,
very intellectual person who is capable of putting these yes trains into people, but that's not necessarily
mm,
what he's doing. He's giving you very valuable information, and the people who are capable to receive it, they will receive it.
yeah,
No worries there. And those are people who tend not to become extreme radical people.
yeah,
But the people who don't end up doing stuff like this, where they're kind of like dangerous for debation. Um,
mm,
but at the same time, I wouldn't say they're harmful to society because you kind of need those people. They're the most passionate of people, and if they're directed in the right way, they support the cause, and they're very passionate. So that intense emotion that they are able to apply to a
mm,
situation can become very useful. But at the same time, like, you want to be diplomatic
yeah.
about it.
It's a good thing that you brought Andrew Tate up as an example to explain the importance of extracting information and to specifically in this concept, the intellectual capacity or the capacity in general of him to be able to put these conversational skills into perspective, mold them to the person that he's talking to, but then also subjugate himself to possibly and definitely, as we see it now, being misconstrued by the masses because he's tailoring the conversation to the person that he's speaking to, but the information is being absorbed by hundreds of thousands of people who he's not talking to. It's not possible to tailor a conversation generally to the masses, right? There's always going to be misconstrued. It's good that you bring him up as an example because arguably he's probably the most spoken about person right now. Um, but Oh my God, I just blanked out. I had a fucking interesting point to make. Run me through again what you were saying.
I was saying that they, the way that they
Radicals. Sorry, I've got it. I've got it. Thank you. Your voice was all I needed. Radicals. I take issue with radicals because um, even it's not. I don't know if they're. I argue if they're important or not. The reason why is because radicals are, again, very extremely postured people, and they're not
yeah,
postured with the intention. Usually, they're postured with ill intent, and I think historically, like the KKK comes to mind, right? They're radicals. They're radicals who are postured in a way of defiance. And they're not anarchists. They're not punk rock by any means. They're just bigots. And they're postured in a way to convince themselves and then the masses of ill intent. So those are the kinds of radicals that are, you know, with the intent to inflict harm. Also, what comes to mind is, I've lost it again. But you get the point. You have radicals on ISIS was coming to mind, Al Qaeda, and all these extremist groups in the religious front as well. You've got radicals in all senses. You've got radicals for the racists. You're radicals for religious whatever propaganda. You've got radicals in every sense of the propagandas. All any propaganda has its own spectrum of radicals, but typically, and the when you say that it's yes train that forms these radicals to some degree, I do agree. But the yes train comes from when the yes train comes from imbuing ill intent into humans that were possibly would have never ended up that way. It brings into question whether we need radicals at all, because
right. It is.
we can have stupid people and have them not be radical,
Mm,
strongly opinionated people not radical.
mm.
You know,
I question that too, brother, because like obviously we don't want bad people in our life who are in the world that have ill intent. But at the same time, like it's difficult for me to think that something that's driving them so forcefully
yeah,
is not justified for them. It may not be
yeah, it is.
justified in truth, but it is justified to
Yeah,
them.
it definitely
And
is. Yeah, that's
yeah,
what creates them.
right.
They've
So
justified it to themselves to that degree.
yeah, and so that's exactly what's happening with the neoliberals as well, right? But
Mm,
here's where it gets interesting. If it's completely justified to an individual that whatever he's doing and following is the right path, how much should that person control that passion, right? Like we
mm,
can talk about this topic in multiple different ways, but all I'm trying to point out is I think all those people who are radicals have those justified reasons for it to themselves. They're
mm,
justifying themselves, and
mm,
ill intent may be a part of that justification, so as to not really make ill intent, but their passion for disagreement is so high that it creates an ill effect, which I believe is
mm.
true. But ill intention is something that that I think is very unique to people who are hurt people.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's a I think the distinction here that I'd maybe throw in is that with hurt people hurting people, the idea of vengeance comes to mind, right? So the intent is more of save yourself, not necessarily with the
Right.
objective of hurting other people, which more often than not tends to translate into, you know, producing more harm than good for their surroundings,
Yes.
like school shooters and that. Well, in that case, is usually we're talking about like kids, but that's a whole different idea. It's just a very coarse example. But you also the okay, since we're on the topic of neoliberals, let's talk about neoliberals, right? I take issue with these kids who are now gluing themselves to random artifacts. They're defacing fucking millions and
uh,
millions of dollars worth of property.
ridiculous.
Vandals,
Mm.
absolutely disgraceful and disgusting and absolutely pathetic.
Yeah.
So why is that a problem, right? They have a propaganda, right? They've got an image in their head that they think needs to be shout it all the top of the fucking roofs of the world,
Mm-hmm.
and they're not doing it from a position of Attica. It's not like, oh, we're anarchists, we're fucking, because they're not trying to start a revolution for the sake of starting a revolution. They're starting a revolution because that's what they want to do, because they want to be heard. Which brings to uh the table a new sense of people that are radical, a new category of radical people who just want to be heard for whatever reason. And the reason I bring this up is because just like hurt people hurting people, there's insecure people that want to make a difference before they even can, let alone if it even matters that they make a difference or not. For example, this is gonna go one of two ways, but Greta Thunberg is one of those people, right? Came up with this whole environmental fucking propaganda. Oh, we're gonna die. Oh my God, do this, do that. But we've been talking about that for a long time. We've known the world has gone through multiple ice ages,
Yeah.
and we've known that the world is going. The environment the ozone is depleting, this and that, and everyone's doing their part,
Yeah.
whatever. But she made it sound like it was gonna happen tomorrow.
Yeah.
It was, she expedited it because that's what would set her aside from everyone else who's like, yeah, meteorologists are talking about it.
Right.
People are talking about it. Everyone's kind of has the gist of the idea. But what I've got to do is I need to come up and say that, please stop now,
Mm-hmm.
right the fuck now,
Mm-hmm.
unplug your computer now, or else
Right.
the world's gonna die tomorrow. Like
Right.
it's this idea of people, learn to make your bed before you set out to change the world. The
Right.
same thing is what I see with these property defacing vandals
Yeah.
who kind of want to get themselves in a position of power without having earned it. And that is something that I take immense problem with, immense
Yeah.
issue with.
I think the I think what we're getting at is when someone is too passionate, they fail to recognize the outcomes of this extreme passion that might lead into ill effects on everybody.
Yeah, but
Right.
also the passion is misguided. It's not, they're not passionate for the cause, they're passionate for selfish objectives. And that selfish objective comes from a place of insecurity.
I agree. I agree with that to some extent. But where I would like put put a different idea is where a lot of people like shit on Greta Thunberg. Like she's a child, right? And obviously she's not doing things the right way, which I agree with. But
Yeah,
also I commend that level of passion that she has because I truly think that it requires that kind of emotion to actually make a difference. Because a lot of people will agree on what is right and then just sit
yeah,
at home and do jack shit about it. Like for example,
yeah.
the cobalt thing comes to mind, right? Like we all know about
Mm,
this cobalt mine that Joe Rogan
mm,
has now like
mm,
exposed to the world. Everybody knows there's a huge fucking slavery happening there. Huge,
mm,
immense, worse than any first world country can even picture and imagine.
mm.
It's worse. And we won't do jack shit about it. We will record a
Yeah,
podcast on a laptop. We will record the podcast on a phone, and nobody will give up the phone, right?
yeah,
the the issue rises there when you're too diplomatic for to an aspect. Like there's a fault to that, and there's also a fault to being too passionate, and it
yeah,
creates this conundrum that I also don't have the answer to. But what I can say for sure is I definitely commend that aspect of Greta being able to put herself on the line there. I'm
yeah,
not saying that's the smartest move. A lot of people shit
yeah,
on her. A lot of grown men who can understand what we are talking about will shit on
yeah,
her, which to an extent makes sense because a lot of people need to hear that she's being too passionate about it, or
yeah,
not too passionate, but the passion that she has is not guided correctly,
yeah,
and a lot of people need to hear that as well. But
yeah,
there should be enough credit that she is able to stick up like that. I think what's lacking is a true leadership quality that's able to make everybody feel safe about
yeah,
it. If somebody is able to project that idea of a true and good purpose that facilitates for everybody, then when these people of passion exist, you can let
yeah,
them loose and they will run with it. But then, like, that's what I'm saying. The conundrum is how diplomatic must you be so as to not lose the
yeah,
passion to create change,
yeah.
and how diplomatic must you be in order to control the
Mm.
action so that you don't fuck shit up.
That's a perfectly sound line of reasoning, right? Um, Now, in terms of, let's again get to this. Greta Thunberg is a Greta. Greta Thunberg is a good example in this particular cause for the point that I want to make, which is there's always going to be people with different objectives, right? especially in our time, which arguably is one of the most volatile times where of opinion, in the terms of opinion,
Yeah.
everyone's got an opinion on the matter,
Yeah.
and people are now construing opinions to make them or equate them to fact,
Mm.
which is in itself a problem.
Mm.
So people will always have this. When Greta Thunberg took the spotlight, there's always going to be a group of people who genuinely believe what she's saying, genuinely object to what she's saying, and then there's extremists on both ends who just agree with her because it matches, it fits their propaganda, or their little image of what it means to. So that guest strain we were talking about before comes from a personal objective, and then there's people who have personal vendettas who just focus on getting her off the pedestal because why does she get to have the pedestal
Right.
and I don't? So we've got extremes on either end, but you've got to take into consideration also that what was she like 13, 14, 12? I don't know, something along those lines when she got the spotlight.
Yeah.
Imagine putting your child in a position where you've let her know that her opinions are going to change the world.
Yeah.
You feed her with this or the him or
Mm.
whatever with this idea that what they're thinking in their 12-year-old 13-year-old little brain is so right. It's not only right, it's so right to the extent that they have the capacity to change the world. Everybody wants to be president when they're 10 years old.
Mm.
Not everyone becomes president.
Yeah.
Not everyone gets to live to become an astronaut or a fucking fisherman or whatever,
Right.
fucking Ahab who finds the next Moby Dick. No one gets to write their fucking great Odyssey, even though they
Mm.
want to when
Mm.
they're kids. So for me, a large part of the problem also is the fact that that was even allowed to happen.
Right.
I don't know how or what fucking absurd stars had to align for her to actually get to the position, unobstructed, for her to be able to do that because the
Yeah.
obstructions came after the fact,
Yeah.
obviously. But there was no obstructions to her to get to that point,
Yeah.
I would imagine, or at
Yeah.
least very minor So that it's that is the part that's insane to me is that how are you okay with feeding a child with that sort of a mentality?
But you know what's interesting though? Until she actually came up and did something like, I agree with you, by the way. I agree with everything
Yeah.
that you said. Until she came up to the point where she so passionately spoke about this topic, everybody agreed on her stance
Mm,
if it was not portrayed as passionately. And nobody really portrayed the issue that they're portraying about her after she did it. So what I'm getting to here is the fact that she was able to passionately create some kind of energy, whether it was not the way that she wanted it to go. What she
yeah.
created was a discussion of people who are now equally passionate enough to disagree with it. And that's
Mm,
actually creating some movement in the topic,
mm, yeah.
right? But before that, everything was stale. And
Yeah.
so it's again, it's a dichotomy of understanding that she should not have been allowed to portray such arbitrary like opinions with no factual basis, right?
Mm,
And uh I some part of me kind of empathizes with the fact that we have to teach children to be very purposeful and
mm,
driven to create
yeah.
change, but at the same time I completely see what you're saying, and it can create danger. And also at the same time, if that was not to be the case, nobody would be even talking about the situation. So
Yeah. Yeah.
she's effectively, without knowing, created some kind of movement towards a direction, and that direction
Yeah.
is now debate. And now finally, that is the most healthiest position that we can be in, because the most unhealthiest position I think that we can be in as a society is to not debate anything, is to be
Yeah.
stale about everything. But now there's actually people on either side creating this,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then the people in between will make the change.
Yeah, I think that's a very good thing to point out as well. I think the thing with Andrew Tate,
Yeah.
words, words are hard. Uh, yeah, that's also a very relevant and good example of the same situation where he's creating a platform for people to now discuss, which in his case I think is a bit more intentional than in Greta's case, but
Yeah.
um, that's again speaks towards what good skill and conversational capabilities can look like in the hands of the right people, right? So if used well, everything obviously sets out a platform. Like the same thing that we're aiming to do as well to some smaller degree is to get people to start talking about things and to a larger degree.
This ain't no small degree, my friend. This
No,
will
I'm
be
saying
one of the biggest revolutions in the world. No, but I get your point.
thank you.
No, with Andrew Tate, bro, what he did, has like made it more solidified to people that, like, even though he might be wrong, even though we might disagree, can we all just shut the fuck up and realize that what he did allowed some people who were not talking about it before to have some sense of balls to come up and talk about what they truly felt. There were
Yeah.
people and there were men who did not want to talk about this at all. But now
Yeah.
suddenly there's a guy who's created the pathway for all these other subsects of people who agree with him to come out and actually pose their opinion because there's someone
Yeah.
strong enough to lead them. So here's an interesting point. If you are if you want to create change, right?
Yeah.
What people lack, I think the people who truly are capable of creating change in a diplomatic and rational way, what they lack is a sense of comfort in their opinion, a sense of confidence in their
Hmm.
opinion, and that is
Hmm.
something that Andrew Tate has brought to the game, where he
Hmm.
has a certain opinion and he's going to voice it even if everybody may not agree with it. What he encourages is discourse, and I completely agree with that. What we should encourage is discourse, and he's doing
Yeah.
it from a place where he does not need anybody else to make him comfortable to do it. He's broken that system that has
Yeah.
existed before. And I'll point out very clearly, it has existed before when it most needed to exist. Martin Luther King, Nelson
Hmm.
Mandela, Gandhi ji, all these people are people who broke the manifold of being stale. And those are
Hmm.
people who started to create that change where they did not need to rely on anybody else.
Yeah.
And Andrew Tate is also one of those people who now make room for more people to voice their opinions. And now it's funny that we speak of this man who's brought up this change, because imagine how vile the situation would have been if all of these people felt it inside,
Hmm.
but they only agreed to what was most comfortable to agree to,
Yeah.
which was, before he came, the most comfortable thing to agree to was, the idea of everything that he's opposed to, like
Hmm.
being submissive as men, being women doing whatever is what all his ideas, everything opposed to those ideas. You see that there's a giant audience for people who agree to their ideas, and before he came about, you also saw the same giant audience had agreed to something else
Hmm.
before. So there's like a big question of, we need to make everybody feel completely comfortable to voice their opinion,
Yeah.
or should everybody take into their own account that if you have an opinion, regardless of how much hate you get, voice them like a
Yeah.
true integral human being.
Yeah. But we're also, what we don't want to do and what we're not doing is encouraging radical behavior, because this can also translate into the wrong hands and the wrong minds as, oh, I should be the one, pushing for the change, and I should be the one. Not everyone is capable of doing that, and you need to
But I
understand
think
that as well.
everybody should have a go at it. Like, for example, Kanye West, right? He comes to mind when you bring that up.
I somehow I knew that was going to come up, but all right, go on.
Like, this man has the radicalness present in him to bring about
Yeah.
change, right? To bring about change, whether it's good or not, I am not going to
Yeah.
put any of my opinions here.
Yeah.
But he is capable of bringing that radical change. Now, what I encourage is that people are willing enough to do it, because I'll tell you why. Whoever is the most influential at the end of the day will win, right? And somehow we have constructed, and I think the Roman Empire is greatly credited here, to
Hmm.
construct a system of democracy where um it's not necessarily influence, but there's a system running, and you have to follow these systems to get into place and to be able to create change. But what we're also observing at that point, what was happening was there was only extreme radicalism. And so when that idea of democracy came about, it made so much more sense. Now
Hmm.
I think what's happening is there's this intense idea of democracy where everybody has to take the system, do it the right way, follow all these things that takes fucking years to make anything different, anything change. We have presidents that get changed every 4 years. No real purpose is being followed. There's these democratic systems that we follow where nothing is moving at all. So there's like
Hmm.
this balance sheet that we're not really filling out anymore. And what is important to me is not the people who create the radical change. What's important to me is the idea that some sense of radicalism is important too, because if you get caught in this rut of democratic environments, you will not be able to create change because you don't have enough force to move it.
mm,
And so, what I'm also saying with that is we need to encourage everybody to take a certain amount of responsibility. And when that happens, everybody will be tested. And who will win is the person who will win. At the end of the day, we should be grateful for the fact that, Nazi Germany did not win the war,
yeah,
right? And that needed to happen so that we establish that this is wrong. This is
yeah,
wrong to kill uh whoever was killed. And I have extreme empathy when I speak of this as well, even though it may sound kind of like unsalted. There is
mm,
salt to it. I feel like when people are encouraged enough to make those decisions, to step up off of their own chair and actually make a change, then we see people who are sometimes followed and sometimes who are not followed. And the people with not strong enough ideas, people who are not resonating with these people, they won't just be followed. That's it. Like when Kanye
mm,
West came out with that stuff, he had some people following him, but it was not
mm,
strong enough to create the change that he wanted, which is what we
yeah,
need, because now we're able to see all of the people who are actually against us, as opposed to
mm,
believing that they're all on our side,
yeah,
right? And so now we can also see that because he was able to do something like that, the people who are against that are now stronger because they've actually had something to fight for and fight against, because we don't want that shit happening again. So we will stand
mm,
up for it stronger this time.
yeah,
And so, as when we look on a zoomed out perspective on the progression of humankind in society, then I think
mm,
like it makes some sense to bring in these ideas, which is now taking place to an extent where I think it's moved. It's finally come out of the staleness. It's come back
mm,
into discourse where the right is battling the left, left is battling the right, and then in between there are people who are just comfortable like that, who are like on both sides.
yeah.
So I think that is healthy because it creates some kind of momentum. Without momentum, everybody's just there.
Yeah, that's true. I feel like the society, like you described it now, is more of a there's a it's a instead of becoming a emotionless entity, which it was, it's now there is some form of emotion that's been birthed into it. You know, people are obviously friction creates the best results,
Exactly.
rather
Yeah,
than
that's what I'm trying
everyone,
to say.
yeah, rather than everyone just being agreeable and everyone taking a moderate stance on things. Speaking of which, fucking cast your votes, kids. But um, I see the value in it. I feel like the reason I made those comments earlier is because there is a sense of innate fear that you get after having witnessed all these radical movements and this
Mm,
my encouragement of not everyone having to try the right thing is having seen people on both ends of the spectrum. But when you put it into perspective, it does make sense that they wouldn't have assumed their rightful places of either, with a large following or without a large following in whatever direction if there was never any friction to begin with, right? So you can't just eliminate friction. This is the sort of mentality, the thing that I was doing is the sort of mentality that pushes society back into this momentum less stale state when everyone just assumes like, okay, not everyone is capable of doing everything, which is true to an extent, but we need friction. That
mm,
is true. Without friction, things go nowhere. Um, but yeah, the objective is still to be able to manage that friction in the best way possible to achieve the most positive outcome out of all of it. And historically, we can always look at things. It's easier to look at things in hindsight and say, okay, it happened for a good reason or whatever. Going forward, people have this notion of everything happens for a reason because of that sort of hindsight perspective. But it's very hard to contemplate those things whilst it's happening. How do we know
mm,
if things that are happening are right at the minute?
right.
And what do the consequences sort of do the ends justify the means? Again, is it worth it to go through all of that just to reach a point of now we know? Because to a large degree, what we've been missing and to a large degree, and the very basic of terms, what has been lacking is a sense of direction. You know, it's the leadership part of it that's been missing. Where what I'm trying to insinuate, or what is something that I think would be a utopian society, is where we can have a frictionless society with the appropriate leadership qualities. Like Andrew Tate, for example. Again, he's got a massive following. He's broken down a lot of this stigma, and he's broken down a lot of these. people that are hiding behind these walls of just agreeing to the norm because that's more socially acceptable rather than coming up and voicing their opinions. What he's done is provided a sense of both direction, sense of security for people to come up and say what they want to say, and a basically a leader for a movement. He's guiding these people who've already either had those opinions or were on the fence about it, have now started going in a certain direction. Can we achieve that without friction? Questionable, right? But in a utopian society, that which is what I was insinuating, like again in previous comments, was to create that utopian society without friction, without the
So,
consequences of it, but with the rightful leaders.
and this is interesting, right? Because each person's version of a utopian society is different. So I think where this point becomes valuable is when we understand some of the countries that have functioned best and been able to move in a direction smoothly for a long time have been societies that actually have a dictatorship. And
Mm.
let me clarify what I'm about to say before y'all get like fucking too excited about things.
All of our two viewers are fucking typing away. Like, no.
Yeah, 1 hour 56 minutes later. Why I say that is because when somebody brings about this idea that they have and they are able to amass a large quantity of people,
Yeah.
what they create is their version of a utopian society. And so now what's
Hmm.
happened essentially is the majority of people's utopian society has now manifested. And now, because the majority of people have a utopian society that is prevalent, they will follow it in that direction and they will put all their energy towards it because every single person believes in it, in that
Yeah.
majority. Now, that small minority of people that exist, you have to, they have to create the friction. If they don't think it's real, if they think that what the direction is going in is false, then you have to
Mm.
be able to create that friction between the people that make the dictatorship collapse. And that is what has happened. Obviously, that is the only way that it tends to function. So, in those people, there will be, in that minority of people, there will be one person who is capable of overthrowing that dictatorship because his idea of a utopian society will then start to manifest and start to grow, because the idea of the previous utopian society would have manifested a few cracks in the wall, and those
Mm.
cracks will be used again to learn. And the important thing is not the fact that that dictatorship, that previous dictatorship, functioned for so long. It will function for so long, but what happens when it functions for so long is that there's cracks, and there's always
Mm.
going to be cracks. And let me make this more of a digestible answer, because all of us want an end goal. We want a
Mm.
conclusion. Where does this end if it's a perpetual thing? It will not end because you motherfuckers are trying to create a psychological society. Psychological societies and psychological structures will never take you anywhere. That's why in the one of the podcasts that we were talking about, the design of the structure will perpetually change. So the only way to get outside of that is to remove psychology. And this is
Mm.
where the evolution podcast comes into play, because what we are trying to move forward is to tell people that this is exactly what is going to happen. There's going to be people who are extremely influential to create a movement in a certain way, and then that
Mm.
happens for 100 years, and then it breaks down, and then again happens for 100 years. And the Romans were the closest to be able to make some kind of change to it, like a long-lasting change, which is
Mm.
democracy. And now we assume that that's the best way to go, but then now we are seeing cracks in democracy as well. So
Mm.
I believe the only way to really come to a conclusion about this is to be able to get rid of these psychological structures that create the
Mm.
society, and instead use something else that structures the society. What would that be?
Yeah.
Objective reality towards understanding what the human animal is capable of doing, looking
Yeah.
at it from a fashion that does not involve ego. And
Yeah.
now it comes to the idea that people have tried this before. Of course, people have tried this before, because this is what, like, the saints are doing. This is what Buddha tried to do. This is
Mm.
what I would say maybe Russell Brand to an extent is trying to do. There have been people who have been able to contemplate the best idea for society to be harmonious. I'm not saying
Mm.
it's utopian, but harmonious. But they have not been able to manifest it because they have not been able to be passionate enough to create a radical change. And what we need
Mm.
is a radical change. We do not need radical people.
Yeah.
We need a change that's radical enough to take us out of a construction that we've built that we cannot get out of. We need force, we need escape velocity. And that's what's happening. That's why I think that the whole structure of society must be changed. And it's one thing for me to sit and talk about it, but wait until I actually try and achieve it.
Well said. Very well said. But yeah, I think I definitely want to pick out and agree specifically to the point that we don't necessarily need radicals. We need people, or we need a radical movement in whatever way, shape, or form that's going to happen. And at least in the situation that we're in currently, we try to push, again, establish a platform for discourse, right? But the discourse isn't limited, which is the advantage that we pose compared to most radical movements. Is it's not filled with a direction in a certain um, someone's certain perspective of utopia. It's more filled towards establishing a platform for general discourse to move in a very somehow specifically general direction, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
just
We're not
move. And then I
exactly,
think nature
exactly.
takes care of it. Nature just takes care
Yeah.
of it after a point.
So in all the previous times that we've fucking countless times already in just a few episodes that we've released that we've focused on the importance of moving forward with purpose and with direction and with great vigor. Now we're adding on the vigor part of it. So we've discussed what it means to have or the requirement to have movement in, and we've discussed what the importance of having a direction associated with that movement is. And now we've established that it needs to be done in a way that it's like we've kept reiterating, you've kept reiterating the passion, the vigor that's attached to it. It needs to be driven in a direction with an immense sense of purpose. And as long as that movement happens and we're encouraging that movement in a way, or if it's focused in a direction that everyone on an individual level is capable of achieving, if they choose to do so, that brings to mind a possibility of something that I think we're probably tapping into something that people would have just let slide, alternatively, if we hadn't put it in the way that provided enough of reason or empirical reasoning for why it's the most important and most impressive thing that people can do. It would have just been like, yeah, sure, we could do that, but why would we want to do that? This is why. Because this radical tenacity that people can have and they can to achieve this societal movement altogether starts on an individual scale. And that particular movement, like you said, will evolution will take care of the rest, but that you need to be the one to get that ball rolling.
Mm.
And I think that's the most impressive part of these discussions that we have, is that platform for the people that want to recognize it, and because now that I've sort of spelt it out, that is what the one of the intents behind all of this is, if not the biggest and the main intent.
Yeah, I mean, like we want to change people. Why would I invest my time into a podcast if I don't see value for it? I'm not just sitting
Yeah,
here behind a camera trying to tell you guys this shit because it makes me fucking entertained. It does not entertain me to sit behind a camera and speak these things. These are things because I genuinely see no fucking movement for mankind. I
mm,
genuinely have a problem with how we function as a society. And yeah, I can sit down and be like, I've figured out the ways where I can be the most peaceful in my own life, which I
mm,
have genuinely figured out where I can, it's fine. Like anything that happens to my life won't disturb me. And you're
yeah,
possibly even in that, you're in that place too, where like not a lot from the outside will hurt you anymore. But what we see
yeah,
with that is just a redundant life after a time. Okay, fine, we've achieved some sense of like a huge sense of stability in our own lives. Fine, that's done. Now what?
mm,
Only people who are able to, like you said, it has to start from an individual scale. Only people who are able to fix their houses first will then be able to fix
yep,
something else, right? And so
yep,
the feeling that I have of freedom after having fixed my own house, fixed my own mind through these things that I'm trying to educate and also perpetually stay in that mode of education
yeah,
is allowing me the liberty to be able to propagate that. And that is why
yeah.
I'm here. That is why I, yeah, I'll save the rest for a podcast where people are still watching. At
You
two
know,
hours and 5 minutes.
well, we have these conversations because we're again, this throughout this conversation is sort of a reflection of how passionate we are with talking about the things that we want to talk about. But yeah, again, if this gets to the right hands, if people want to collaborate, and we keep wanting to have guests on, and this is why we have guests who are capable of providing us with value and bang for our buck. We've had like some very impressive guests on the podcast. So if it gets to the right ears and the right hands, and people share this enough, we'll eventually get more people to be able to propagate this in the right direction, and to get them to see that we're standing for something that's far more important than people currently are able to recognize, let alone comprehend. But yeah, as long as we get the traction on the road, it's going to end up in the place that we want it to be.